Hello and welcome to the third reading of Coming Up for Air by George Orwell. We begin on Part 2, Chapter 1. The world I momentarily remember when I saw King Zog's name on the poster was so different from the world I live in now that you might have a bit of difficulty in believing I ever belonged to it. I suppose by this time you've got a kind of picture of me in your mind, a fat, middle-aged bloke with false teeth and a red face, and subsequently you've been imagining that I was just the same even when I was in my cradle. But 45 years is a long time, and though some people don't change and develop, others do. I've changed a great deal, and I've had my ups and downs, mostly ups. It may seem queer, but my father would probably be proud of me if he could see me now. He'd think it is a wonderful thing that a son of his should own a motor car and live in a house with a bathroom. Even now, I'm a little above my origin, and at other times I've touched levels that we should never have dreamt of in those old days before the war. Before the war. How long shall we go on saying that, I wonder? How long before the answer will be, which war? In my case, the never, never land that people are thinking of when they say before the war might also be before the Boer War. I was born in '93, and I can actually remember the outbreak of the Boer War, because of the first-class row that Father and Uncle Ezekiel had about it. I have several other memories that would date from about a year earlier than that. The very first thing I remember is the smell of sainfoin chaff. You went up the stone passage that led from the kitchen to the shop, and the smell of sainfoin got stronger all the way. Mother had fixed a wooden gate in the doorway to prevent Joe and myself, Joe was my elder brother, from getting into the shop. I can still remember standing there clutching the bars and the smell of sainfoin mixed up with the damp plastery smell that belonged to the passage. It wasn't until years later that I somehow managed to crash the gate and get into the shop when nobody was there. A mouse that had been having to go at one of the meal bins suddenly plopped out and ran between my legs. It was quite white with meal. This must have been when I was about 6. When you're very young, you seem to suddenly become conscious of things that have been under your nose for a long time past. The things around about you swim into your mind one at a time, rather as they do when you're waking from sleep. For instance, it was only when I was nearly 4 that I suddenly realized that we owned a dog. Naylor, his name, was an old white English terrier of the breed that's gone out nowadays. I met him under the kitchen table and in some way seemed to grasp, having only learnt at that moment, that he belonged to us and that his name was Naylor. In the same way, a bit earlier, I discovered that beyond the gate at the end of the passage was a place where the smell of sainfoin came from. And the shop itself was a huge scales and the wooden measures and the tin shovel and the white lettering on the window and the bullfinch in its cage, which you couldn't see very well even from the pavement because the window was always dusty. All these things dropped into place in my mind one by one like bits of a jigsaw puzzle. Time goes on, you get stronger on your legs, and by degrees you begin to get a grasp of geography. I suppose Lower Binfield was just like any other market town of about 2,000 inhabitants. It was in Oxfordshire, I keep saying was, you notice, though after all the place still exists about 5 miles from the Thames. It lay in a bit of valley with a low ripple of hills between itself and the Thames and higher hills beyond. On top of the hills there were woods and sort of dim blue masses among which you could see a great white house with a colonnade. This was Binfield House, the hall everyone called it, and the top of the hill was known as the Upper Binfield, though there was no village there and wasn't been for 100 years or more. I must have been nearly 7 before I noticed the existence of Binfield House. When you're very small, you don't look into the distance, but by the time I knew every inch of the town, which was shaped roughly like a cross with a market place in the middle. Our shop was the High Street a little before you go to the marketplace, and on the corner there was Mrs. Wheeler's sweet shop where you spent a halfpenny when you had one. Mother Wheeler was a dirty old witch, and people suspected her of sucking the bull's eyes and putting them back in the bottle, though there was never proof. Farther down there was the barber shop with the advert for Adola cigarettes, the one with the Egyptian soldier on it, and, curiously enough, they're using the same advert to this day, and the rich, boozy smell of bay rum and latakia. Behind the houses, you could see the chimneys of the brewery. In the middle of the marketplace, there was the stone horse trough, and on the top of the water, there was always a fine film of dust and chaff. Before the war, and especially before the Boer War, it was summer all the year round. I'm quite aware that it's a delusion. I'm merely trying to tell you how things come back to me. If I shut my eyes and think of Lower Binfield any time before I was, say, 8, it's always in summer weather and I can remember it. Either it's the marketplace at dinner time with a sort of sleepy, dusty hush over everything and the carrier's house with the nose dug well into his nose bag. munching away, or it's a hot afternoon in a great green juicy meadow round the town, or it's about a dusk in the lane behind the allotments, and there's a smell of pipe tobacco and night stalks flowing through the hedge. But in a sense, I do remember at different seasons, because all my memories are bound up with things to eat, which varied at different times of the year, especially the things you seem to find in the hedges. In July, there were dewberries, and they're very rare, and the blackberries were getting red enough to eat. In September, there was sloes and hazelnuts. The best hazelnuts were always out of reach. Later on, there were beech nuts and crab apples. Then there were kinds of minor foods that used to eat when there was nothing better going. Haws, but they're not much good, and hips, which have a nice sharp taste if you clean the hairs out of them. Angelica is good in early summer, especially when you're thirsty, and so are stems of various grasses. Then there's sorrel, which is good with bread and butter, and pig nuts, and a kind of woods shamrock, which has a sour taste. Even plantain seeds are better than nothing when you're a long way from home and very hungry. Joe was 2 years older than myself. When we were very small, Mother used to pay Katie Simons 18 pence a week to take us out for walks in the afternoons. Katie's father worked in the brewery and had 14 children, so that the family were always on the lookout for odd jobs. She was only 12 when Joe was 7 and I was 5, and her mental level wasn't very different from ours. She used to drag me by the arm and call me baby, and she had enough authority over us to prevent us from being run over by dog carts or chased by bulls. But so far as conversation went, we almost on equal terms. We used to go for long, trailing kinds of walks, always, of course, picking and eating things all the way. Down the lane past the allotments, across Roper's meadow, and down the mill farm, where there was a pool with Nudie and Tiny cart on it. Joe and I used to go fishing there when we were a bit older, and back by the upper Binfield Road, so we passed a sweet shop that stood on the edge of town. This shop was in such a bad position that anyone who took it went bankrupt, and to my own knowledge it was 3 times a sweet shop, once a grocer, and once a bicycle repair shop, but it had peculiar fascination for children. Even we had no money, we'd go that way as to glue our noses against the window. Katie wasn't in the least above sharing a farthing worth of sweets and quarreling over her share. You could buy things worth having for a farthing in those days. Most sweets were 4 ounces a penny, and there was even some stuff called Paradise Mixture, mostly broken sweets from other bottles, which was 6. When there were farthings, everlastings, which were a yard long and couldn't be finished inside half an hour, sugar mice and sugar pigs, which were 8 a penny, and so were licorice pistols. Popcorn was a halfpenny for a large bag, and a prize packet which contained several different kinds of sweets. A gold ring and sometimes a whistle was a penny. You don't see prize packets nowadays. A whole lot of kinds of sweets we had in those days have gone out. There was a kind of flat white sweet in modus printed on them, and also a kind of sticky pink stuff in an oval matchwood box with a tiny spoon to eat with, which cost a halfpenny. Both of those have disappeared, so have caraway comfits, and to have chocolate pipes and sugar matches, and even hundreds and thousands you hardly ever see. Hundreds and thousands were a great standby when you only had a farthing. And what about penny monsters? Does one ever see a penny monster nowadays? It was a huge bottle holding more than a quart of fizzy lemonade, all for a penny. That's another thing that was the war killed, stone dead. It always seems to be summer when I look back. I can feel the grass around me as tall as myself, and the heat coming out of the earth, and the dust in the lane, and the warm greeny light coming through the hazel boughs. I can see the 3 of us trailing along, eating stuff out of a hedge, with Katie dragging me by the arm, saying, "Come on, baby," and sometimes yelling ahead to Joe, "You come back here this minute. You'll catch it." Joe was a hefty boy with huge, big, lumpy sort of head and a tremendous calves. The kind of boy who's always doing something dangerous. At 7, he'd already got into short trousers, with the thick black stockings drawn up over the knee and the great clumping boots that boys had to wear in those days. I was still in frocks, a kind of Holland overall that Mother used to make for me. Katie used to swear a dreadful ragged parody of a grown-up dress that descended from sister to sister in her family. She had a ridiculous great hat with her pigtails hanging down behind it, and a long, draggled skirt with trailed on the ground, and bottom boots with the heels trotted down. She was a tiny thing, not much taller than Joe, but not bad at minding children. In the family like that, a children is minding other children as soon as it's weaned. At times, she tried to grow up and be ladylike, and she had a way of cutting you short with a proverb which to her mind was something unanswerable. If you said, "Don't care," she'd answer immediately, "Don't care, we made to care. Don't care was hung. Don't care was put in a pot and boiled till it was done." Or if you called her names, it would be, "Hard words break no bones," or, when you'd been boasting, "Pride comes from a fall." This came very true one day when I was stunting along pretending to be a soldier and fell into a cowpat. Her family lived in a filthy little rat hole of a place in the slummy street behind the brewery. The whole place had The place swarmed with children like a kind of vermin. The whole family had managed to dodge going to school, which was fairly easy in those days, and started running errands and doing other odd jobs as soon as they could walk. One of the elder brothers got a mother for month for stealing turnips. She stopped taking us out for walks a year later when Joe was 8 and going too tough for a girl to handle. He discovered that in Katie's home they slept 5 in a bed and used to tease the life out of her about it. Poor Katie, she had her first baby when she was 15. No one knew who the father was, and probably Katie wasn't too certain herself. Most people believed it was one of her brothers. The workhouse people took the baby and Katie went into service in Walton. Sometime afterwards she married a tinker, which, even by the standards of her family, was a come-down. The last time I saw her was in 1913. I was biking through Walden, and I passed some dreadful wooden shacks behind the railway line with fences around them made out of barrel staves, which the gypsies used to camp at certain times of the year when the police would let them. A wrinkled up hag of a woman, with her hair coming down and a smoky face, looked at least 50 years old, came out of one of the huts and began shaking out a rag mat. It was Katie, who must have been 27. Chapter 2. Thursday was market day. Chaps with round red faces like pumpkins and dirty socks and huge boots covered with dry cow dung, carrying long hazel switches, used to drive their brutes into the marketplace early in the morning. For hours it'd be terrific hullabaloo, dogs barking, pigs squealing, chaps in tradesmen's vans who wanted to get through the crush cracking their whips and cursing, and everyone who had anything to do with the cattle shouting and throwing sticks. The big noise was always when they brought a bull to market. Even at the age, it struck me that most of the bulls were harmless, law-abiding brutes that only wanted to get their stalls in peace, but a bull wouldn't have been regarded as a bull if half the town had to turn out and chase it. Sometimes some terrified brute, generally half-grown heifer, used to break loose and charge down a side street, and then anyone who happened to be in the way would stand in the middle of the road and swing his arms backwards like the sails of a windmill, shouting, "Woo woo." This was supposed to have a kind of hypnotic effect on an animal, and certainly it did frighten them. Halfway through the morning, some of the farmers would come into the shop and run samples of seed through their fingers. Actually, Father did very little business with the farmers because he had no delivery van and couldn't afford to give long credits. Mostly he did a rather petty class of business, poultry food and fodder for the tradesmen's horses and so forth. Old Brewer of the mill farm, who was stingy old bastard with a gray chin beard, used to stand there for half an hour fingering samples of chicken corn and letting them drop into his pockets in an absent-minded manner. After which, of course, he finally used to make off without buying anything. In the evening the pubs were full of drunken men. In those days beer cost 2 pence a pint, and unlike the beer nowadays it had some guts in it. All through the Boer War, and recruiting sergeant used to be in the 4-ale bar of the George every Thursday and Saturday night, dressed up to the nines and very free with his money. Sometimes next morning you'd see him leading off some great sheepish red-faced lump of a farm lad who's taken the shillings when he was too drunk to see the found in the morning that it would cost him 20 pounds to get out of it. People used to stand in the doorway and shake their heads when they saw them go past, almost as if he had been a funeral. Well, now listen, for a soldier, just think of it, a fine young fellow like that. It just shocked them. Listening for a soldier in their eyes was the exact equivalent of a girl's going to on the streets. Their attitude to the war and the army was very curious. They had the good old English notions that the redcoats and could tell you an answer that, and one of the very few people in the lower Binfield who stuck the same options all through the war. He always denouncing Joe Chamberlain and some gang of people that he referred to as the Park Lane riffraff. I can hear him now having one of his arguments with Father. Them and their far-flung empire. Can't fling it too far for me. Heh heh heh. And then Father's voice, a quiet, worried, conscious kind of voice, coming back at him with the white man's burden and our duty to the poor blacks whom these Boers treated something shameful. For a week or so after Uncle Ezekiel gave it out that he was a pro-Boer and a Little Englander, that they were hardly on speaking terms. They had another row when the atrocity stories started. Father was very worried by the tales he'd heard, and he tackled Uncle Ezekiel about it. Little Englander or no, surely he couldn't think it right for these here Boers to throw babies in the air and catch them on their bayonets, even if they were only N-word babies. But Uncle Ezekiel just laughed in his face. Father had got it all wrong. It wasn't the Boers who threw babies in the air. It was the British soldiers. He kept grabbing hold of me. I must have been about 5 to illustrate. Throw them in the air and skewer them like frogs, I tell you. Same as I might throw your younger Sahir, and then he'd swing me up and almost let go of me. And I had vivid pictures of myself flying through the air and landing plonk on the end of a bayonet. Father was quite different from Uncle Ezekiel. I don't know much about my grandparents. They were dead before I was born, only know that my grandfather had been a cobbler and late in life he married the widow of a seedsman, which was how he came to have the shop. It was a job that didn't really suit Father, though he kept the business inside out and was everlastingly working. Except on Sunday and every occasion on weekday evenings, I never remember him without meal on the backs of his hands and in the lines of his face and what was left of his hair. He'd married when he was in his 30s and must have been nearly 40 when I first remember him. He was a small man, a sort of gray, quite little man, always in shirtless short sleeves and white aprons and always dusty looking because of the meal. He had a round head, a blunt nose, a rather bushy mustache, spectacles, and butter-colored hair, the same color as mine, but he lost most of it, and it was always mealy. My grandfather had bettered himself a good deal by marrying the seedsman's widow, and Father had been educated at Walter Grammar School, where the farmers and the better-off tradesmen sent their sons, whereas Uncle Ezekiel liked to boast that he'd never been to school in his life and had taught himself to read by a tallow candle after working hours. But he was a much quicker-witted man than Father. He could argue with anybody, and he used to quote Carlyle and Spencer by the yard. Father had a slow sort of mind. He never liked to he never taken to book learning, as he called it, and his English wasn't good. On Sunday afternoons, the only time when he really took things easy, he'd settle down by the parlor fireplace to have what he called a good read at the Sunday paper. His favorite paper was The People. Mother preferred the News of the World, which she considered had more murders in it. I can see them now, a Sunday afternoon, summer, of course, always summer, a smell of roast pork and greens still floating in the air, a mother on one side of the fireplace starting off to read the latest murder, but gradually falling asleep with her mouth open, and Father on the other side in slippers and spectacles, working his way slowly through the yards of smudgy print, and the soft feelings of summer all around you, the geranium in the window, a startling cooing somewhere, and myself under the table with the bop, making myself that the tablecloth is a tent. Afterwards at tea, as he chewed his way through the radishes and spring onions, Father would talk in a ruminative kind of way about the stuff he'd been reading, the fires and shipwrecks and scandals in high society, and these here new flying machines and the chap. I noticed that to this day he turns up in the Sunday papers about once in 3 years, who was swallowed by a whale in the Red Sea and taken out 3 days later alive, but bleaching white by the whale's gastric juice. Father was always a bit skeptical of the story and of new flying machines, otherwise he believed everything he read. Until 1909, no one in Lower Binfield believed that human beings would ever learn to fly. The official doctrine was that if God had meant us to fly, he'd have given us wings. Uncle Ezekiel could help retorting that if God had meant us to ride, he'd have given us wheels, but even he didn't believe in the new flying machines. It was only on Sunday afternoons, and perhaps on the one evening a week when we looked in at the George for a half a pint, that Father turned his mind to such things. At other times he was always more or less overwhelmed by business. There wasn't really much to do, but he seemed to be always busy, either in the loft behind the yard, struggling about with sacks and bales, or in the kind of dusty little cubbyhole behind the counter in the shop, adding figures up in a notebook with a stump of pencil. He was a very honest man and a very obliging man, very anxious to provide good stuff and swindle nobody, which, even in those days, wasn't the best way to go on in business. He would have been just the man for some small office job, a postmaster, for instance, or station master of a country station. But he hadn't either the cheek and enterprise to borrow money and expand the business, or the imagination to think of new selling lines. It was a characteristic of him that the only streak of imagination he ever showed, the invention of a new seed mixture for cage birds. Bowling's mixture it was called, and it was famous over a radius of nearly 5 miles. Was really due to Uncle Ezekiel. Uncle Ezekiel was a bit of a bird fancier and had quantities of goldfinches in the dark little shop. It was his theory that cage birds lost their color because of lack of variation in their diet. In the yard behind the shop, Father had a tiny plot of ground in which he used to grow about 20 kinds of weeds under wire netting, and he used to dry them and mix their seeds with ordinary cannery seed. Jackie, the bullfinch who hung in the shop window, was supposed to be an advertisement for Bowling's mixture. Certainly, unlike most bullfinches in cages, Jackie's never turned black. Mother was fat ever since I remember her. No doubt it's from her that I inherit my pituitary deficiency, or whatever it is that makes you get fat. She was a largish woman, a bit taller than Father, with a hair good deal fairer than him, and a tendency to wear black dresses. I'm sorry, I'm stupid. But except on Sunday, I never remembered her without an apron. It would be an exaggeration, but not a big one, to say that I never remember her when she wasn't cooking. When you look back over a long period, you seem to see human beings always fixed in some special place and some characteristical attitude. It seems to you that they were always doing exactly the same thing. Well, just as when I think of Father, I remember him always behind the counter, with his hair all mealy, adding up figures with a stump of pencil, which he moistens between his lips, and just as I remember Uncle Ezekiel with his ghostly white whiskers, straightening himself out and slapping his leather apron, so that I think of Mother, I remember her at the kitchen table, with her forearms covered with flour, rolling out a lump of dough. You know the kind of kitchen people had in those days, a huge place, rather dark and low, with a great beam across the ceiling and a stone floor and cellars underneath. Everything enormous, or so it seemed to me when I was a kid. A vast stone sink, which didn't have a tap but an iron pump, a dresser covering one wall and going right up to the ceiling, a gigantic range which burnt half a ton a month, a gigantic range which burnt half a ton a month and took God knows how long to black lead. Mother at the table rolling out a huge flap of dough, and myself crawling around messing about with bundles of firewood and lumps of coal and tin beetle traps. We had them in the dark corners, and they used to be baited with beer, and now and again coming up to the table to try to cage a bit of food. Mother didn't hold with eating between meals. You generally got the same answer. Get along with you now. I'm not going to have you spoiling your dinner. Your eyes are bigger than your belly. Very occasionally, however, she'd cut you off a thin strip of candied peel. I used to like to watch Mother rolling pastries. There's always a fascination in watching somebody do a job which he really understands. Watch a woman who really knows how to cook, rolling dough. She's got a peculiar, solemn, in-draw air, a satisfied kind of air, like a priestess celebrating sacred rite. And in her own mind, of course, that's exactly what she is. Mother had thick, pink, strong forearms, which were generally mottled with flour. When she was cooking, all her movements were wonderfully precise and firm. In her hands, eggs, whisks, and mincers and rolling pins did exactly what they were meant to do. When you saw her cooking, you knew that she was in the world where she belonged, among things she really understood. Except through the Sunday papers and an occasional bit of gossip, the outside world didn't really exist for her. Although she read more easily than Father, and unlike him, used to read novelettes as well as newspapers, she was unbelievably ignorant. I realized this even by the time I was 10 years old. She certainly couldn't have told you whether Ireland was east or west of England, and I doubt whether any time up to the outbreak of the Great War she could have told you who was Prime Minister. Moreover, she hadn't the smallest wish to know such things. Later on, when I read books about Eastern countries that were practice polygamy and the secret harems where the women are locked up with black eunuchs mounting guards over them, I used to think how shocked Mother would have been if she heard of it. I can almost hear her voice. Well, now, shutting their wives up like that, the idea, now that she'd known what a eunuch was. Eunuch. But in reality, she lived her life in a space that must have been as small and almost as private as the average zenana. Even in our own house, there were parts she never set foot. She never went into the loft behind the yard and very seldom into the shop. I don't think I even remember her serving a customer. She wouldn't have known where any of the things were kept, and until they were milled into flour, she probably didn't know the difference between wheat and oats. Why would she? The shop was Father's business. It was the man's work, and even about the money side of it, she hadn't very much curiosity. Her job, the woman's work, was to look after the house and the meals and the laundry and the children. She'd have had a fit if she'd seen Father or anyone else of the male sex trying to set a button for himself. So far as the meals and so forth went our ways, one of those houses where everything goes like clockwork, or no, not like clockwork, which suggests something's mechanical. It was more like some kind of natural process. You knew that breakfast would be on the table tomorrow morning in much the same way that you knew the sun would rise. Although her life, Mother went to bed at 9 and got up at 5. All through her life, Mother went to bed at 9 and got up at 5, and she'd have thought it vaguely wicked, sort of descendant and foreign and aristocratic to keep later hours. Although she didn't mind paying Katie Simons to take Joe and me out for walks, she would have never tolerated the idea of having a woman in to help with the housework. It was her firm belief that a hired woman always swept the dirt under the dresser. Our meals were always ready on this tick. Enormous meals, boiled beef and dumplings, roasted beef and Yorkshire, boiled mutton and capers, pig's heads, apple pie, spotted dog, and jam roly-poly, with grace before and after. The old ideas about bringing up children still held good, though they were going out fast. In theory, children were still thrashed and put to bed on bread and water, and certainly you were liable to be sent away from table if you had too much noise eating, or choked, or refused something that was good for you, or answered back. In practice, there wasn't much a discipline in our family, and of the two, Mother's was the firmer. Father, though he was always quoting, "Spare the rod and spoil the child," was really much too weak with us, especially with Joe, who had a hard case from the start. He was always going to give Joe a good hiding, and he used to tell us stories which I never believed were lies, about the frightful thrashings his own father would give him with a leather strap, but nothing ever came of it. By the time Joe was 12, he was too strong for Mother to get him across her knee, and after that there was nothing anything could do with him. At the time, it was still thought proper for parents to say don't to their children all day long. You'd often hear a man boasting that he'd thrash the life out of his son if he caught him smoking or stealing apples or robbing a bird's nest. In some families, these thrashings actually took place. Old Lovegrove, the saddler, caught his two sons, great lumps aged 6 and 15, smoking in the garden shed and walloped them so that you could hear it all over the town. Lovegrove was a very heavy smoker. The thrashings never seemed to have any effect. All boys stole apples, robbed bird nests, and learnt to smoke sooner or later, but the idea was still knocking around that children should be treated rough. Practically everything worth doing was forbidden in theory anyways. According to Mother, everything that a boy ever wanted to do was dangerous. Swimming was dangerous, climbing trees was dangerous, and so were snowballing, hanging on behind carts, using catapults and squalers, and even fishing. All animals were dangerous except Naylor, the two cats, and Jackie, the bullfinch. Every animal had its specific recognized methods of attacking you. Horses bit, bats got in your face, earwigs got into your ears, swans broke your legs with a blow of their wings, bulls tossed you, and snakes stung. All snakes stung, according to Mother, and when I quote the penny encyclopedia to the effect that they didn't sting but bit, she only told me not to answer back. Lizards, slowworms, toads, frogs, and newts also stung. All insects stung except flies and black beetles. Practically all kinds of foods except the food you had at meals were either poisonous or bad for you. Raw potatoes were deadly poison, and so were mushrooms unless you bought them at the greengrocer. Raw gooseberries gave you colic, and raw raspberries gave you a skin rash. If you had a bath after a meal, you died of cramp. If you cut yourself between the thumb and forefinger, you got lockjaw. And if you washed your hands in the water eggs were boiled in, you got warts. Nearly everything in the shop was poisonous, which was why Mother had put the gate in the doorway. Cow cake was poisonous, and so was chicken corn, and so were mustard seed and carswood poultry spice. Sweets were bad for you, and eating between meals was bad for you. Though, curiously enough, there were certain kinds of eating between meals that Mother always allowed. When she was making the plum jam, she used to let us eat the syrupy stuff that was skimmed off the top, and we used to gorge ourselves with it till we were sick. Although nearly everything in the world was either dangerous or poisonous, there were certain things that had mysterious virtues. Raw onions were a cure for almost anything. Stocking tied around your neck was a cure for a sore throat. Sulfur in your dog's drinking water acted as a tonic, and old Naylor's bowl behind the back door always had a lump of sulfur in it, which stayed there year after year, never dissolving. We used to eat tea at 6. By 4, Mother had generally finished the housework, and between 4 and 6 she used to have a quiet cup of tea and read the paper, as she called it. As a matter of fact, she didn't often read the newspaper except on Sundays. The weekday papers only had the day's news, and it was only occasionally that there was a murder, but the editors of the Sunday paper had grasped that people don't really mind whether their murders are up to date, and when there was a new one on hand, they'd hash up an old one. Whenever there was no new murder on hand, they'd hash up an old one, sometimes going as far back as Dr. Palmer and Mrs. Manning. I think Mother thought of the world outside Lower Binfield chiefly as a place where murders were committed. Murders had a terrible fascination for her because as she often said, she didn't know how people could be so wicked, cutting their wives' throats, burying their fathers under cement floors, throwing babies down wells. How anyone could do such things. The Jack the Ripper scare had happened about the time when Father and Mother were married, and the big wooden shutters we used to draw over the shop windows every night dated from then. Shutters for shop windows were going out. Most of the shops in the higher street didn't have them, but Mother felt safe behind them. All along she said she had a dreadful feeling that Jack the Ripper was hiding in Lower Binfield. The Crippen case, but that was years later, when I was almost grown up, upset her badly. I can hear her voice now, gutting his poor wife and burying her in the coal cellar. The idea, what I'd do to that man if I got a hold of him. The curiosity enough when she thought of the dreadful wickedness of the little American doctor who dismembered his wife and made a very neat job of it, taking all the bones out and chucking the head into the sea. If I remember rightly, the tears actually came into her eyes. But what she mostly read on weekdays was Hilda's Home Companion. In those days, it was a part of regular furnishings of any home like ours, and as a matter of fact, it still exists, though it's been a bit crowded out by more streamlined women's papers that have come up since the war. I had a look at a copy only the other day. It changed, but less than most things. There are still the same enormous serial stories that go on for 6 months, and it all comes right in at the end with orange blossoms to follow. And the same household hints, and the same ads for sewing machines and remedies for bad legs. My apologies. Remedies for bad legs. It's chiefly the print that the illustrators that have changed. Chiefly the prints and the illustrations that have changed. In those days, the heroine had to look like an egg timer, and now she had to look like a cylinder. Mother was a slow reader and believed in getting her 3 pennies worth out of Hilda's Home Companion. Sitting in the old yellow armchair beside the hearth, with her feet on the iron fender and the little pot of strong tea stewing on the hob, she'd worked her way steadily from cover to cover, right through the serial, the 2 short stories, the household hints, the ads for Zambuck, and the answers to correspondence. Hilda's Home Companion generally lasted her the week out, and some weeks she didn't even finish it. Sometimes the heat of the fire or the buzzing of the blue bottles on summer afternoons would send her off into a doze, and at about 5:45 she'd wake up with a tremendous start, glance at the clock on the mantelpiece, and then get into a stew because tea was going to be late. But tea was never late. In those days, till 1909 to be exact, Father could still afford an errand boy, and he used to leave the shop to him and come in for tea with the back of his hands all mealy. Then Mother would stop cutting slices of bread for a moment and say, "If you'll give us grace, Father," and Father, while we all bent our heads on the chests, would mumble reverently, "Fought we bought to receive. Flat we bought to receive. Lord, make us truly thankful. Amen." Later on, when Joe was a bit older, it would be, "You gave us grace today, Joe," and Joe would pipe it out. Mother never said grace. It had to be someone of the male sex. There were always blue bottles buzzing on summer afternoons. Ours wasn't a sanitary house. Precious few houses in Lower Binfield were. I suppose the town must have contained 500 houses, and there certainly couldn't have been more than 10 with bathrooms or 50 with what we should now describe as a water closet. In summer, our backyard always smelt of dustbins, and all houses had insects in them. We had black beetles and a wainscoting and crickets somewhere behind the kitchen range, besides, of course, the mealworms in the shop. In those days, even a house-proud woman like Mother didn't see anything to object to in black beetles. They were much a part of the kitchen as the dresser or the rolling pin, but there were insects and insects. The house in the bad street behind the brewery, where Katie Simons lived, were overrun by bugs. Mother or any of the shopkeeper's wives would have died of shame if they had bugs in the house. In fact, it was considered proper to say that you didn't even know a bug by sight. The great blue flies used to come sailing into the larder and sit longingly on the wire covers over the meat. Drat the flies, people used to say, but the flies were an act of God, and apart from meat covers and fly papers, you couldn't do much about them. I said a little while back, and the first thing I remember is that the smell of sane foin, but the smell of dustbins is almost as a pretty early memory. It's also a pretty early memory. When I think of Mother's kitchen, with the stone floor and the beetle traps and the steel fender and the black leaded range, I always seem to hear the blue bottles buzzing and smell the dustbin, and also old Naylor, who carried a pretty powerful smell of dog. And God knows those are worse smells and sounds. God knows there are worse smells and sounds. Which would you sooner listen to, a blue bottle or a bombing plane? Thus ends the reading. Sorry, it was a little rough. I'm kind of struggling. I had too much caffeine. But if you enjoyed, make sure to hit the subscribe button, and we'll see you in the next one. Peace.